Hello, friends. For today's episode, I'm delighted to introduce you to one of my root lamas, a co-founder of Dawn Mountain Center for Tibetan Buddhism, Harvey Aronson, Lama Namgyal Dorje, who studied with many wonderful lamas in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, earned his PhD in Buddhist studies, and has been practicing as a psychotherapist in private practice for decades now. He's one of the most qualified people to speak about today's topic, some of the cross-cultural misunderstandings that can happen when Western converts to Buddhism hear traditional teachings like "don't get angry" and interpret that through our own cultural and individual backgrounds. Harvey will be teaching a series starting September 7th, this Sunday, on this topic, both in person in Houston, Texas, and online, and you can find a link to learn more and register in the show notes. I'll also leave a link to his wonderful book, Buddhist Practice on Western Ground, that I highly recommend to anyone practicing the Dharma in a Western context. Toward the end of our conversation, he offers suggestions for people who would like to access the wisdom of the field of psychology but can't afford a therapist. You can find some of the readings he suggests in the show notes. Also, Harvey's summer teaching series that we mention in this episode isn't publicly available for free, but I'll link Dawn Mountain's YouTube channel, which has hours and hours of past teachings and practices like Green Tara, the life of the Buddha, and much more. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Harvey, and I hope to see you online for his upcoming teaching series. All right, I am delighted to introduce everyone watching, everyone listening to one of my root teachers, Harvey Aronson, PhD, also Lama Namgyal Dorje, one of the teachers, the lamas at Dawn Mountain Center for Tibetan Buddhism. And Harvey is going to actually share with us today one thing that I think he's one of the I'm obviously biased, but I think he's one of the best people to speak on this topic, which is considering Buddhism and therapy, how they can support each other, but also how some of the ideas we're introduced to are very different. So Harvey, thank you for coming on and joining us today.
My pleasure. You are one of our best students. So it's, of course, a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you. Well, part of the context for this is that Harvey has been doing some really wonderful teachings during the summer series of Dawn Mountain's teachings, and I'll have some of those linked in the show notes so you can watch them also. But you've been talking about, Buddhism and anger, Buddhism and attachment. I would love for you to, perhaps just introduce one of those topics or both, whichever one you'd like to focus on, and just, either with your own story as an introduction or just jumping into the theory, kind of introduce us to what's going on with these two major cultural systems.
So, believe it or not, you were in fact breaking up an enormous amount. Could you try repeating it?
Yeah, I wonder. I have an Ethernet connection. It might be your Wi-Fi, Harvey Law. I don't know.
Could be. I don't know what to do about that.
We could turn off video if you'd like and just do an audio call. Hopefully it wouldn't break up.
I'd prefer for people to be able to see.
Okay.
So you basically were asking me to dive in on my own to one of these topics.
Do you have a preference as to which one to start with? Or maybe we can only cover one. I mean, they're huge topics.
Well, maybe you could fine-tune it a little bit and say what maybe is your interest, or what's a kind of edge that really grabs your perspective and that will prime my pump a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. So part of what really got me thinking about having you on to share some of this is the last Sunday teaching that you did a couple of Sundays ago. You talked about, anger, and it's kind of mushing together in my mind with your chapter on anger in Buddhist Practice on Western Ground. But the thing that really struck me is, I think I have been under-expressing anger most of my life. Came to Buddhism with a certain set of imprints, and then the teachings about like don't feel anger, stay calm, and like don't express anger to people, they just fit so naturally. And then it took me decades to realize they fit naturally because I never learned a really important psychological skill of standing up for myself. And it's not actually Buddhist practice that I'm doing, it's just tuning out of my own personal feelings and reality. And I know you have experience with that, so I would love to hear, you know, how we may be falling into these traps and not even know it as practitioners.
How many days do we have?
Well, given samsara, quite a long time, but
Yeah, so I don't know whether to go biographical, theoretical, or practical, or a little bit of all the above.
could you start with a little biography? I find it very helpful to hear the story of how you encountered psychotherapy.
Yeah, so I think frame it all. By age about 19, I was already familiar enough with kind of the obsessive nature of my own thinking that I knew I experienced it as very, very painful. And so in 1964, when Richard Alpert came to Brooklyn College to give a talk on LSD, Oriental mysticism, and cognitive psychology, I had had some vague understanding of what LSD research was at the time and had read the total of Khalil Gibran's The Prophet and Paramahansa Yogananda's autobiography of a yogi. That was my exposure to Asian stuff. And I think I may have read an article in the very, very scholarly journal Playboy by Aldous Huxley on LSD and spirituality, which somehow it piqued my interest. And so when Richard Alpert came, it turned out to be an unbelievable experience for me. I was most interested in what he was talking about in terms of imprinting and habits and restrictions and limitations, and then freedom, that one could be cognitively and emotionally free, and one could have universal love. Just touched me. It was really, really a conversion experience for me. I was feeling pins and needles in my arms and legs. I was like mesmerized. And it was like I had no idea that people talked about this material really, and that it was a legitimate area of interest and concern. And so I, at that point, had been a hotshot chemistry major, and for whatever reason, LSD just sounded like too fast, too much too fast for me. And I decided that I would really start exploring Hinduism, Buddhism, whatever I could, which I did. Was going to graduate school, and then got a grant to be in India to study Tibetan Buddhism. And when in India, heard about Theravada meditation. And when I did that in 1971, I found that I really had some kind of sense of shock absorbing between my normal internal pressure and my actual doing or enacting or thinking. There was just some sort of felt relief. And then 1972, it's a 30-day course with Sri Satyanarayan Goenka, and it'd be 7 days of mindfulness called Vipassana in his tradition. And then 3 days was dedicated to metta, or love meditation. So it was 7 and 3, 7 and 3, 7 and 3 for a total of 30 days. And no talking. And I experienced a great deal of shaking during that period. Really, really kind of uncomfortable. And really, I mean, I had to be isolated. It was so distressing to people around me. But at the end of the 30 days, I had an unbelievable experience of love. So much so that even though I frame myself as an agnostic, the only thing that made sense for me to say was it felt like I was touched by God, which there was some cognitive dissonance between an agnostic who said, well, I'm touched by God, because this is what, couldn't put any other explanatory frame on it. It turns out in the Theravada tradition, that's what they say exactly. This is a practice of one of the, what's called the Brahma Viharas, which is, Vihara means a way of living or a place of living, and Brahma is God. So when you cultivate love, you're living with God, you're touching God, you're touched by God, especially if it's very deep. So I became very, very oriented towards wanting to be loving, wanting to be kind, studied the Mahayana teachings on love and compassion, had attended already, I think by that point, Geshe Rupten's teachings on love and compassion, and just to a small group of us in Dharamsala. And then when we moved to Virginia, Jeffrey Hopkins was teaching about the Tibetan way of generating love and compassion. Very, very oriented towards that. What I was not aware of was that I'd come from a background and a home within which the expression of anger was not encouraged. And in fact, when I wanted a cap pistol, I had to steal one in order to get it, because my mother wouldn't allow me to have a gun. And a gun meant like a BB gun or even a little play gun with, I don't even know what you call that, but they'd have little strips of paper with, you would hit the little strips of paper and it would make a loud popping noise. I had to steal that. But I wasn't really aware of what I was doing to myself emotionally and psychologically, but I was kind of subliminally aware of between what I was reading in the scriptures and the way someone like Goenka taught, and then even Tibetan teachers taught, and the way the teachings were being translated into English. Don't feel, don't express anger. So I got very shut down, unbeknownst to myself. And then in 1977, we were living communally with Jeffrey Hopkins, and I think the teacher who was there at the time may have been Demo Loto Rinpoche, one of the great Geshe Gelugpa teachers of his era. And at a certain day in the afternoon, I just started feeling I was having a heart attack. And the next day I went into the doctor to have my heart checked. There's nothing wrong with my heart. He said, well, you probably were having a panic attack. I didn't know what he was talking about. But, there's pressure in the heart, rapid breathing, sense of just the world is coming to an end. And said you could do biofeedback, take propranolol, which is an anxiety reduction medication, or you could go into psychotherapy. Biofeedback, from what I understood, would be a little bit like meditation. Medication would alter my mind, and I was a meditator, and I thought, well, if possible, I don't want to alter my mind with medication. And it felt like psychotherapy would be a lot of talking, and I was trying to quiet my mind. Why would I want to talk more? So let's try biofeedback. And I was relatively successful at being able to lower my temperature in my fingertips. I was taking breaks during the day to relax. But in the 10th session of the biofeedback, I was asked a very distressing question to me at the time, and it was electrically amplified. And the instructor said, I'll be back in 15 minutes when you quiet down. And of course, he came back in 15 minutes. And the amplification was still unmistakable. I was agitated. It was very, very humbling. And I knew that clearly I was not able to master this level of emotional upset with the biofeedback, and I still didn't want to take medication. So I'll try psychotherapy. I wasn't really interested. I ended up with somebody named Jeffrey Binder, who actually years later I found a book by him on brief psychotherapy. So it was brief psychotherapy. and 10 sessions. And initially I didn't start noticing it, but it was only after maybe 4 or 5 weeks. It was like I wasn't allowing myself any upset in those days. And really my internal image of what I should be was like a rock, just imperturbable. I should be like a rock. And he would ask me these questions, is such and such okay with you? Oh, yeah, it's fine. Everything is fine. I had filled out this questionnaire before the biofeedback, areas of life with difficulty. The only area was maybe a little bit of concern with maybe I won't get tenure. I was a little bit anxious, about that. Everything else was fine.
Just for context, for anyone who doesn't know what tenure is, that's when you're a professor, but you don't have you're not tenured yet, and you have to go up for review. And if you don't get tenure, your career is kind of over. So it's a really big deal, just for context.
Thank you so much. So about session 4 or 5, I start realizing, well, in the prior sessions, like 6 or 7 days after the session, I was feeling a little bit grumpy. Then it was 6 days after the session, a little bit grumpy. Then there was a horse on the road, and we almost hit the road, and for some reason I realized I was really grumpy. Maybe it was about session 3 or 4. And then in the last session, or the next to the last, I got grumpy in the session. And I really didn't want to allow myself to be grumpy because I'd be a bad Buddhist. And the therapist, who was a good therapist, Jeffrey Binder, what's happening? And I kind of almost forced myself in Buddhist English to say, anger is there. And after these 10 sessions, it was clear that I was sort of angry about some things that I had initially said everything was fine, but they kept asking me, is this okay? And it's like 4 days later, I'd realize it's not okay. 3 days later, I was realizing it's not okay. And at the end of 10 sessions, it was as astounding as the lecture by Richard Alpert. It was like, I thought everything was okay, and none of it was okay. It was astounding. And that was about 77, and I taught at UVA until 82, so there was still 4 more years of, I didn't get tenure, and I needed to figure out what I was going to do with my life. And I had one more session of 10 sessions with Jeffrey Binder the following year. But having not gotten tenure, I did a very, very thorough assessment of who I was and what I liked. I used my color, what color is your parachute? It was really, really useful. And, when people were kind of feeling suicidal or depressed, they would come to me, and I really enjoyed talking to my students. And it just became clear through doing a very careful self-assessment that I should maybe consider becoming a therapist, because it was so astounding what I had learned about myself. It was revolutionary that I actually was angry. So, at one point in this whole thing, I ended up at a course at Insight Meditation Society, and one of the teachers there said, I'm not going to sit here and justify anger. So slowly, I got into my own therapy and got into my own feelings and looked at Buddhism ever more closely and looked at language ever more closely and looked at psychotherapy ever more closely. And, here you got these Buddhist teachers are saying, don't get angry, in translation. And then eventually reading and learning and studying and learning that anger is considered what's called a core affect for human beings. It's healthy. Anger. We need to set boundaries with others, and anger assists us in setting boundaries. And looking a little bit more carefully and then thinking about, there are protests for righteous causes, and people seem angry. Holiness Dalai Lama says it's justified to, advocate for social justice. When people go out and advocate for shut it down, they're screaming. They're really clear with their energy. He's saying it's okay to protest for social justice. Well, what about anger? Well, what are they actually saying in the texts? Well, there are a lot of words for this anger, what comes out in anger in English. And a lot of what it seems that they're really talking about in the original is harmfulness, literally the wish to harm somebody. Okay, guess what? You study psychotherapy. No psychotherapist will tell you to go out and harm somebody. They might ask you in your office, what do you feel about that person? And they might even encourage you to verbalize or feel some really hurtful thoughts. But they, for sure, if they're any good, will say, I'm not encouraging you to do any of this, and you should not. But we're trying to understand, what are you feeling? So there's a difference, between feeling and acting. Huge in the psychotherapeutic view of things. But many, many people come into me, and I had the same feeling. If you feel something, you're going to do it. If you feel like killing somebody, you're going to kill somebody. Or if you say you want to kill somebody, you're going to kill somebody. There's that danger. People who are on the obsessive side of things think like that a lot. If I feel something, it's so dangerous, I'm going to do it. I have to protect myself. Over the years, I've thought about this a lot. There's a book review by Richard Schwader, who's a cultural psychologist, and the beginning paragraph goes something like, I really need to just print it out and have it in my wallet. If a group of women got together in Bombay and were to talk about their emotional feelings, they would all feel it was defiling them, it was dangerous. Whereas if a group of women got together on the Upper East Side of Manhattan and didn't talk about their feelings, they would feel that was defiling and dangerous. So I got to thinking about feelings and emotions quite a lot, and who I was and what culture I was kind of acculturating myself to in Asia, what culture I came from in my own family. And certainly it became clear that anger, and there really can be many, many forms of healthy anger in terms of setting boundaries, in terms of being assertive, in terms of looking out for oneself, that really is the function of anger. And even hate is a human emotion. We experience it. It's very, very interesting. If you look really, really carefully, it is true that if you look at the mindfulness instructions, Gautama is not shown saying, when you feel anger, whatever that means, whether it's just the assertive feeling of anger or hatefulness, he doesn't say you shouldn't feel it. He says you identify, I know that I'm feeling anger. It is impermanent. That which is impermanent is unsatisfactory. That which is unsatisfactory is not some kind of autonomous, living forever self. He doesn't say don't feel anger. There are other places where there are instructions like, if you feel hateful, it's really, really terrible. He says that, even though he doesn't say don't feel it. He says it's just terrible. But in the mindfulness text, he doesn't say don't feel it. He says know it. Know how it is. So putting all that together in the blender of my life, it became clear that in the context of psychotherapy, many, many people come in who, like myself, are shut down. It's not okay to feel anger. It's not allowed. You're not allowed to know that you're feeling it, and you're not allowed to express it. And even if you're seeing something that is objectively worthy of a boundary, you're not even seeing it. So in the alcoholic family, we say that the unwritten rules are you don't see, you don't feel, and you don't say. Turns out those same rules apply in any kind of dysfunctional families where there's been neglect, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. You're not seeing it. You're not feeling it, and you're certainly not talking about it. Within the mindfulness context, if we have, quote, negative feelings, even if they're really, really even hateful, we need to be mindful of those arising. They're impermanent. They're there. We just are mindful of them. We allow them to be impermanent. We see what it's doing to our body. Both therapy and Buddhist practice agree 100%. Do not be hateful in body, speech, and body and speech. Don't say hateful, hurtful things, and don't hurt people physically. Not okay. Place where there's a cultural difference, interestingly enough, is that in therapy, we say it may be important for you to know what's going on and to feel what's going on, and certainly within the context of therapy, be able to express what you feel, because you may have learned how not to protect yourself. The way I express it is, somebody taught you how to take the battery out of the smoke alarm. So, I have some client come in and he's talking about he's in a very toxic divorce and his spouse is taking a brick and breaking his front window. He just sort of says this as if he's reading the stock market report to me. I said, doesn't this disturb you? No. There's no battery in the smoke alarm. And when we've grown up with difficult situations, parents with excessive anger, parents with mood disorders, parents with drinking, parents with physical abuse, emotional, sexual abuse. Sometimes what we find ourselves with in our adulthood is something very, very similar. Why? Because we have an enormous tolerance for it. Because we learned how not to feel it. It's not affecting me. Because I learned how not to be impacted by that as a child. And it's a very, very important coping mechanism as a child. But if you got beaten up as a child and then you come in with a PhD and you're sitting in my office and you're telling me that the man you're with is hitting you and it doesn't register that this is not okay, it's because the battery is out of the smoke alarm and it's not amenable to common sense. It's so painful and so dangerous. It requires a lot of skill and a lot of compassion and a lot of empathy to help someone begin to realize how smoky it was when they were growing up and the pain that was experienced. And we have to be very slow and gentle and caring and supportive and safe to allow people to start recognizing that they've learned how not to feel and not to register dangerous behavior. And that's a gift that psychotherapy offers. And so in the context of therapy, we sometimes encourage people to even imagine very, very kind of aggressive behavior to just get the energy moving, but not to act it out and not to say it out. But even in Buddhist practice, they didn't say don't feel it. They said be mindful. It's actually very, very close. If you read things very, very carefully, they didn't say don't feel it. They said be mindful of it. Know that you're having these feelings and make appropriate decisions. The only other thing to say is that within all of this, there's something called assertive communication, which is so useful. The book that I see as the Bible of this is called Your Perfect Right. A much later version of that is nonviolent communication. But it's all there in Your Perfect Right, which is essentially to say that when we talk, we can describe behavior. Anything that you could do with a video camera is behavior. You came late. You're talking in a loud voice. That's behavior. When you come late or you talk with a loud voice, I feel unloved, unseen, unrespected, threatened, frightened, angry. Whatever it is I feel, I can say my feeling. You do X, and this is what I feel. If you look into it, There are reasons typically that we feel the reaction patterns that we have because of patterns from our childhood. If you come late, I feel like I'm invisible, disrespected, unloved, and that my life is coming to an end. It's not that big a deal objectively, but guess what? If I was an infant and my mother decided, because she had studied in 1945, that you're basically supposed to wait till a specific moment on a clock to feed the baby, what was I feeling when I was hungry and mom wasn't showing up? Desperate, and maybe even that my life was at stake as an infant. And this stuff gets registered in our bodies. And so the deep reaction patterns that we have register in our adulthood with our reactivities. And one of the modes of therapy that really is available to a lot of people now in a kind of self-help module, a book called Outshining Trauma, Ralph de la Rosa. He's both a Buddhist teacher and a psychotherapist, is that we work with these parts of ourselves that get activated through life, but we can actually converse with from a mindful center with these parts that seem to be our reactive parts that almost seem to have a autonomy to them. In Jungian terms, it may be the equivalent of what Jung called the complexes. And we try to understand what went on when I was younger that I get so freaked out if you come 5 minutes late. Can we have some compassion and understanding for this part of me that feels like I'm disappearing? Normally, when we feel vulnerable, we fight, we flee, we freeze, or we fawn. We've added a fourth one recently. Fight, flee, free, or fawn. And I work out of what's called an emotionally focused couples therapy model. Sue Johnson. There's a book also called Emotionally Focused Couples Therapy for Dummies. It's really, really excellent if you're in a couples relationship. But within that understanding, when we are threatened and vulnerable, we fight, flee, freeze, or fawn. So most couples, when they're upset, they fight, flee, freeze, or fawn. What they don't say is, when you've come late, I'm reminded of my childhood when my mom didn't feed me, and I feel so vulnerable, it feels like I'm about to die. But with good therapy, we might arrive at an appreciation of that's what gets activated. What it typically looks like without therapy is, you damn bastard, I can't trust you, you're a liar, you said you were going to come at 3 and now it's 3:03 p.m. and I'm so upset. Yeah. Important for us to understand what's underneath our reaction patterns and to have enormous compassion and empathy for ourselves and the parts and the reaction patterns that we carry that we came by honestly. And that when we can talk about these honestly with our partners, shared vulnerability creates love. So even with something like anger and hatred, those reactions, there may be some very, very appropriate reasons why we're having those feelings. And if there's injustice, we want to act on that appropriately. But you also want to know when we have some kind of dysregulation in our system, is the dysregulation relating to some kind of vulnerability and what it relates to in our past history. So we can actually talk with the people we care about and help them understand where we're coming from. So at this point, I've covered anger pretty thoroughly with an A to Z of my life history and a lot of wisdom from modern psychotherapy and wisdom from Buddhism in terms of mindfulness, allowing us to become more mindful of our body and our emotions. It's very, very helpful to practice mindfulness so that we know what the heck is going on inside of us. And what psychotherapy attends to is the person and feelings. And those are just not two major categories of interest in terms of personal history in traditional cultural presentation. So it's important to appreciate that we come from two very different cultures. And in our culture, our emotional experience in the now, which is dealt with in terms of mindfulness, and how it relates to our history, and therefore our personal history, is what we pay a lot of attention to in psychotherapy. And it can be very, very helpful for people who struggle in life with their reactivities and their relationships. Pause.
Thank you. That was a great overview. I just want to give another shout out to your book, Buddhist Practice on Western Ground. It's unpacked. Everything you just said is unpacked a lot more in that book. I just found myself wondering, Harvey Law, you mentioned like some of us, and I will totally include myself in this group, we learned how to take the battery out of our smoke detector. Do you have advice? What would you say to somebody who regularly sits on their cushion? They don't feel anger. Everything is fine. Like, what would you say to, your younger self? Is there a way to start tuning into maybe those reaction patterns? Like, how do you start to realize that you're not even aware that there is this massive, stuff going on under the surface?
It's a great question. Sometimes I think life has to knock us on our asses for us to be willing to learn something new. I don't know that, we have a word in therapy, homeostasis. It's a really big word, but it really refers to kind of the gyroscope principle. If you get a gyroscope going, it just wants to be centered. And I think beings at rest tend to stay at rest. And absent things getting upset, people are not necessarily going to want to look at the nitty-gritty of their lives because their lives are working and they're comfortable. And no blame. And maybe they can live till death do us part that way. And if so, maybe they're in a great position where the range of their coping skills and the challenges they face are in a good match and they succeed. That's great. A lot of folks are not really that comfortable. And if people are finding they're not comfortable in their own skin, which many people are not, then in a way I would encourage people to really become more and more aware of how perhaps uncomfortable in their own skin they are, and then seek professional assistance in working with that. Yeah, it's a great question, but not everybody is ready to look at and do it is work of confronting what is it that's making me truly uncomfortable. I don't know that I would have heard it in 1970, whatever, until 77 when I was so humbled and I was not able to even pass a biofeedback exam, as it were. I had to be ready. Continue to think about.
I appreciate that. Again, just thinking of my own example here, sometimes it's hard not to think like, how did I not know how much I was not feeling? But you don't know until you know, I guess. The other thing that just, I don't know
Claire,
if you all have this advice. Yes.
Claire, I was trying along the way, but just to be clear, occasionally I would throw out mild suggestions, but
well,
people are not ready until they're not
like
ready.
At least a decade before I did. Yeah. Yeah. And I just want to give a shout out also, definitely for therapy. I found it super helpful, but also I think this is one of the huge, huge blessings of having a spiritual teacher who really knows you. And I personally am I'm very happy to just read a book and be hands off, and I can do this myself. And I think, I wasn't ready to listen to you, but you planted seeds and eventually the seeds did blossom. So I kind of just want to give a shout out also to, having teachers who are not so famous that you only see them once a year or something. Really having a teacher that you know is so helpful.
I agree. I agree.
Well, I I just have one last question, and maybe it's an impossible one, but for somebody who this is the hard one. For me as a grad student, this was hard. For somebody who would love to do therapy and just does not have access for cost or time or like whatever kind of reasons, do you have recommendations for how that person can start that waking up process, or even if they're not ready, any recommendations for how as a dharma practitioner they might start to, explore this gently?
So the book that I recommended, um, Shining Through Trauma, would be an excellent book. I'm working with a book right now that I'm trying to find the name of. Your Body Knows the Answer. That is a teaching on focusing that is very, very valuable. Your Body Knows the Answer. Um, a shorter version of that, written by another teacher, is The Wisdom of Focusing by Anne Weiser Cornell. The Wisdom of Focusing. And another book that is very, very good in terms of coming to understand one's emotional life is Living Like You Mean It by uh, Ron Fredrickson. And another version of that same perspective, um, it's Not Always Depression by Hilary Hendel. And let's see, there are a lot of books on internal family systems nowadays. So it'd be to find one of the introductory works on internal family systems, very, very elementary ones, and see if that works for you as a guide to just understanding yourself a little bit better. I'm not sure if I can. The Outshining Trauma book is one place to start, and there are probably other books on internal family systems that are recommended in that particular book. Another nice book that Anne Weiser Cornell wrote is Untangling, uh, which is in a way her version of internal family systems, but it's just coming at it from a perspective of focusing. So that's a lot of books already that people could look at and would do a lot of help. And, there's a lot of obstruction, including financial, to finding therapists. But a lot of it happens to be ultimately emotional. And if people were really, really honest in terms of, if you didn't have 5 cups of coffee at the price of coffee, in one week, you might be able to find at least a human therapist at that price even today. So we need to be a little bit honest in terms of, is it really the finances, or is it really, I don't want to see another human being with my problems because I feel ashamed, or I don't think it'll be helpful, or I'm so far gone that who knows if anybody could help me. It takes a lot to get over the resistance of going into see a real life therapist. Really, really. So I appreciate that question. So there are a lot of self-help resources, and there are an endless number of YouTube videos of material on internal family systems, material on focusing, material on accelerated experiential dynamic psychotherapy, material on emotionally focused couples therapy for free. You could get so much free therapy on YouTube.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's like sitting with someone and actually confronting the issue that you don't trust anybody, and really discussing, like, I don't trust you, and who the hell are you to tell me something, and really taking something in from another human being is a great training. But
Yeah.
thank you for bringing up that question.
Of course, I know it comes up for a lot of people. Well, I want to respect your time. I appreciate you, sharing all these resources. I just want to give a shout out to an amazing resource, which is the Dawn Mountain teaching series. It's going to be coming up in the fall. It's online. It's on Sundays. It's available for free. Is that true, Harvey Law?
We'll have to check. It's for free for members for sure. No,
Yeah,
it's for,
yeah. I'm
okay,
a
here's the
member.
discrimination.
Membership is
It's
40
for
bucks a month.
it's for free if you walk in locally, and if you're at a distance, it's actually membership. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, but again, speaking of like the price of a cup of coffee, membership 40 bucks a month at Dawn Mountain, and you get all the access to, live teachings. You can ask questions, and I find it so helpful just to have, the conversation in real time with other students and hearing other people's like experiences too. So I want to give a huge shout out to that. I'll put a link in the show notes so you can find more information, registration page, etc. But I just appreciate you so much, Harvey Law. Oh, speaking of feeling
Same here.
emotions,
Yeah.
thank you.
Same
So,
here.
I mean, I am super happy to get to introduce a whole bunch of new folks who may never have connected with you before. I've gotten so much out of your specific way of putting together. Ooh, sorry. Putting together, this wisdom from therapy and the wisdom from Buddhism, and it's been really life-changing. So, cannot recommend highly enough getting connected to Dawn Mountain and, taking advantage of some of these learning opportunities. Thanks so much for joining me for this conversation with the wonderful Harvey Aronson, Lama Namgyal Dorje of Dawn Mountain. Please check out the show notes for links to Dawn Mountain's YouTube channel, podcast, and other resources. May you and all beings be well.